I watched in horror as the county commissioners raised their hands one by one. 4 votes in favor, 1 against. My grandfather's farm, 60 years of family legacy, gone in 30 seconds of bureaucratic theater. Karen Pemberton sat in the front row with that smug smile plastered across her face. She had orchestrated this entire charade. The eminent domain seizure, the backroom deals, the corrupt construction contracts, all so she could turn my 40 acres of productive farmland into a public dog park. But as I sat there in that sterile government meeting room, watching my world crumble around me, I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago. He said the land would always protect those who protected it. I thought he was just being sentimental. That night, as I walked back to my farmhouse in defeat, I had no idea that buried in his old papers was a weapon more powerful than any lawyer or politician. That is when I discovered I controlled their water supply. My name is Jake Miller, and I am the 3rd-generation owner of Miller Farm. 40 acres of the most beautiful land you have ever seen, passed down from my grandfather when he died 5 years ago. Rolling green pastures, vegetable gardens that stretch as far as the eye can see, and a natural spring that bubbles up from deep underground like liquid crystal. Every morning, I wake up to the sound of roosters crowing and the gentle lowing of my small herd of cattle. I walk out onto my front porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The air smells like fresh earth and growing things. This is the life my grandfather built, and the life I plan to pass on to my own children someday. The farm has been in my family since 1965, when my grandfather bought this land for $3,000. Back then, it was just open countryside as far as you could see. He built the farmhouse with his own hands, dug the first well, and planted the first crops. The original deed sits in a frame above my kitchen table, yellowed with age but still legally binding. I make my living the same way my grandfather did. I grow organic vegetables that I sell at the local farmer's market every Saturday. Tomatoes, corn, squash, beans. People drive from 3 counties over to buy my produce because they know it is grown right, without chemicals or shortcuts. I also raise heritage breed chickens that lay the most beautiful eggs you have ever seen. Deep orange yolks that stand up proud in the pan. For most of my life, this farm existed in peaceful isolation. Just me, the land, and the rhythm of the seasons. But about 10 years ago, things started to change. The city began expanding outward, and developers discovered our little corner of the world. First came the bulldozers, clearing ancient oak trees and leveling hills. Then came the construction crews, building identical houses in perfect rows. The Meadowbrook Hills development grew up around my farm like a concrete and vinyl fence. 200 houses, each one exactly the same. Beige siding, black shutters, and postage-stamped lawns that the Homeowners Association required to be kept at exactly 2.5 inches tall. It was like someone had taken a suburban neighborhood and copy-pasted it across the landscape. At first, I did not mind the new neighbors. Some of them were nice people who appreciated having a working farm nearby. I sold fresh eggs and vegetables to anyone who wanted them. Children from the development would come by to pet the chickens and learn about where their food came from. I thought we could coexist peacefully. I was wrong. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Official letterhead, certified mail, the works. I tore it open expecting maybe a tax notice or something routine. Instead, I found a formal complaint from the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. The letter was signed by Karen Pemberton, HOA president. It informed me that my property was in violation of community standards and needed immediate attention. According to the complaint, My chicken coops were unsightly structures that detract from neighborhood aesthetics. My vegetable gardens were inappropriate landscaping that lowers property values. Even my farmhouse, which had stood proud for 60 years, was described as rustic architecture inconsistent with community standards. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling more confused and angry. Community standards. I had been here decades before their community even existed. I owned my land outright, with no mortgage and no homeowners association agreements. How could they possibly have jurisdiction over my property? That afternoon, I decided to introduce myself to Corinne Pemberton. I drove the quarter-mile to her house, a McMansion that looked exactly like every other house in the development. She answered the door wearing a crisp white blouse and perfectly styled blonde hair. She looked like she had stepped out of a real estate magazine. "You must be the farmer," she said before I could introduce myself. Her voice was sharp and condescending. "I have been expecting you." "I got your letter," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "I think there might be some confusion about property lines and jurisdiction." Corinne smiled, but it was not a warm smile. "There is no confusion, Mr. Miller. Your property may not be part of our HOA, but it directly impacts our community. The smell from your animals, the noise from your roosters, the overall appearance of your land, it all affects our property values." I explained that I had been farming this land for years without any complaints. I showed her my grandfather's original deed, proving that my property rights predated their development by decades. I even offered to work with her on any reasonable concerns. "Reasonable?" Corinne laughed. "Mr. Miller, you are operating what amounts to a hobby farm in the middle of an upscale residential community. That is not reasonable. That is selfish." Over the next few months, the violation notices came faster and more frequently. Excessive noise from roosters at dawn, inappropriate use of agricultural equipment on weekends, failure to maintain grass height standards, offensive odors from livestock. Every single notice was signed by Corinne Pemberton, and every single one demanded immediate compliance with standards that did not legally apply to my property. I tried reasoning with her. I tried explaining property law. I even offered to install privacy fencing if that would help. Corinne dismissed every attempt at compromise with the same cold smile and the same condescending tone. "Mr. Miller," she said during one particularly heated conversation, "I moved here from the city to escape exactly this kind of rural chaos. I paid good money for a house in a nice neighborhood, and I will not watch my investment deteriorate because you want to play farmer." "I am not playing farmer," I said, my patience finally wearing thin. "I am a farmer. This is my land, my livelihood, and my family's legacy." Corinne stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Well, Mr. Miller, legacy or not, I am going to find a way to resolve this situation permanently. You can count on that." As she walked back to her perfect house with its perfect lawn, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in her tone, something calculated and dangerous. This was not just a neighbor complaining about noise. This was a woman with a plan. I just had no idea how far she was willing to go. 6 months later, I was in my garden harvesting tomatoes when I saw the official county vehicle pull into my driveway. A woman in a business suit got out, carrying a manila envelope that looked thick enough to contain bad news. "Mr. Miller," she said, approaching cautiously, "I am Susan Rodriguez from the County Planning Department. I have been instructed to serve you with this notice." My hands were covered in soil from the tomato plants, so I wiped them on my jeans before taking the envelope. The return address made my stomach drop. County Commissioner's Office, Eminent Domain Division. I tore open the envelope right there in my garden. With the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the property my grandfather had worked so hard to build. The official language was dense and confusing, but the meaning was crystal clear. The county was seizing my land through eminent domain for public recreational use. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Susan looked genuinely sympathetic. "I am sorry, Mr. Miller. The commissioners voted last week to approve the seizure. You have 30 days to contest the decision, but I have to tell you, eminent domain cases are very difficult to win." After she left, I sat down on my front porch and read the entire document word by word. The county claimed that my 40 acres of farmland were underdeveloped property that would better serve the public as a recreational facility. Specifically, they planned to convert my entire farm into a massive public dog park with paved walking trails, parking areas, and waste management facilities. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. A dog park. They wanted to destroy 60 years of family history, 60 years of productive agriculture, to create a place for suburban families to walk their pets. But the worst part was yet to come. As I read deeper into the document, I discovered the proposed construction contract. The county had already selected a contractor for the project, Pemberton Construction, LLC. Karen's husband's company would receive a $2 million contract to pave over my grandfather's legacy. The pieces fell into place like a horrifying puzzle. Karen had not been trying to force me out of the neighborhood. She had been setting up a much more elaborate scheme. The months of violation notices, the complaints about property values, the claims about inappropriate land use, it had all been building toward this moment. She had convinced the county commissioners that my farm was a problem that needed to be solved. She had lobbied them to declare my property underdeveloped and better suited for public use. And she had made sure her husband's construction company was positioned to profit from my destruction. I called every lawyer in the county, looking for someone who could help me fight the eminent domain seizure. Most of them would not even return my calls. The few who did speak to me explained that eminent domain cases were expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful. One lawyer was brutally honest. "Mr. Miller, the county has unlimited resources and unlimited time. You have 30 days and whatever savings you can scrape together. The math is not in your favor." I finally found one attorney willing to take my case. David Chen had graduated from law school just 2 years earlier and was still idealistic enough to believe that justice mattered more than politics. He agreed to represent me, but he was honest about our chances. "The legal standard for eminent domain is public benefit," he explained. "The county just has to prove that a dog park would serve the public better than your farm. They do not have to prove that your farm is worthless or that you are a bad neighbor. They just have to convince a judge that the public would be better served by recreational facilities than by agriculture." I spent the next 2 weeks researching everything I could about my property. I gathered documentation of my farm's productivity, its contribution to the local food system, its historical significance. I collected letters from customers who depended on my produce. I even got statements from agricultural extension agents about the importance of preserving farmland. None of it mattered. The county had made its decision and the fix was in. The night before the final hearing, I sat in my kitchen looking at my grandfather's deed hanging on the wall. I thought about all the mornings he had watched the sunrise from this same window, all the seasons he had worked this land, all the hope he had invested in passing something meaningful to the next generation. Karen Pemberton was about to destroy all of that for a construction contract and a dog park. The county commission meeting was held in a sterile conference room that smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams. I arrived early with David Chen, my young lawyer, carrying boxes of evidence and testimonials. We had prepared our case like we were arguing before the Supreme Court. Karen Pemberton was already there, sitting in the front row with a group of supporters from the HOA. She was dressed in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than I made in a month of farmers market sales. When she saw me, she gave me that same cold smile that had haunted my nightmares for weeks. "Good luck, Mr. Miller," she said sweetly. "I hope you understand this is nothing personal. It is just business." The hearing began with the county's presentation. Their lawyer, a sharp-dressed man who spoke in legal jargon, explained why my farm needed to be sacrificed for the greater good. He showed PowerPoint slides with charts and graphs proving that a dog park would serve more people than my vegetable operation. He presented surveys showing that Meadowbrook Hills residents wanted more recreational facilities. Everything he said was technically true, but it completely ignored the bigger picture. Yes, more people would visit a dog park than bought my vegetables, but my farm fed families. It preserved agricultural heritage. It maintained the rural character that had attracted people to this area in the first place. When it was our turn, David Chen stood up and presented our case with passion and conviction. He explained the historical significance of my property. He showed photographs of my grandfather working the same fields in the 1960s. He read letters from customers who depended on my produce for their family's nutrition. "This farm represents everything we claim to value about American agriculture," David said, his voice carrying across the room. "It is family-owned, environmentally sustainable, and deeply connected to the community it serves. To destroy it for a recreational facility is not just wrong, it is short-sighted." I watched the commissioners' faces as David spoke. Their expressions were polite but distant, like they were listening to a mildly interesting lecture about something that did not concern them. I realized with growing horror that they had already made their decision. This hearing was just theater, a legal requirement they had to fulfill before implementing their predetermined plan. Karen had spent months cultivating relationships with these commissioners. She had attended their fundraisers, supported their campaigns, and probably promised them that her husband's construction company would hire local workers and contribute to the tax base. My emotional appeals about family legacy and agricultural heritage could not compete with political connections and economic incentives. The public comment period was a nightmare. Karen had organized a parade of HOA supporters who testified about the need for more recreational facilities. They talked about property values, about serving the public good, about bringing the community together. They made it sound like my farm was a selfish obstacle to progress. I had supporters too, customers who bought my produce, neighbors who remembered my grandfather, even some agricultural advocates who understood what was at stake. But they were outnumbered and outorganized. The most crushing moment came when Commissioner Williams, a man I had known for years, asked me directly, "Mr. Miller, is it not true that a dog park would serve more members of our community than your farming operation?" "Yes, sir," I had to admit, "but serving more people is not the only measure of value. My farm provides food, preserves history, and maintains the rural character that makes this county special." "I appreciate that," Commissioner Williams said, "but we have to consider the greatest good for the greatest number." The vote was 4-1 in favor of the eminent domain seizure. Commissioner Davis, an elderly woman who had grown up on a farm herself, cast the only dissenting vote. She looked genuinely pained as she said, I cannot in good conscience vote to destroy productive farmland for a recreational facility. As the gavel fell, I felt 60 years of family history crumbling around me. Karen Pemberton was already shaking hands with the commissioners, congratulating them on their difficult but necessary decision. Her husband would start construction within 6 months. David Chen put his hand on my shoulder as we packed up our useless evidence. I am sorry, Jake. We gave it everything we had. I walked out of that meeting feeling more defeated than I had ever felt in my life. The legal system had failed me. The democratic process had failed me. The people I had trusted to protect property rights and agricultural heritage had sold me out for political convenience and construction contracts. But as I drove home through the darkness, past the cookie-cutter houses of Meadowbrook Hills, I made a decision that would change everything. If the system would not protect my rights, I would protect them myself. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at my grandfather's deed, looking for some detail I might have missed, some clause or provision that could save my farm. I had read it dozens of times over the years, but desperation made me examine every word with new intensity. The deed was written in old-fashioned legal language that was hard to decipher. Lots of whereas and heretofore and references to survey markers that probably did not exist anymore. But buried in the middle of the second page, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. Including all water rights appurtenant to said property, specifically including but not limited to the natural spring located in the northwest quadrant of the described parcel, with exclusive rights to said water source in perpetuity. Water rights, exclusive rights to the natural spring on my property. I had always known about the spring, of course. It provided all the water for my house and my farming operation, but I had never thought about it in legal terms. I had certainly never considered that other people might be using my water. I spent the rest of the night researching water rights law on the internet. What I learned made me realize that my grandfather had been much smarter than I had given him credit for. When he bought this land in 1965, he had insisted on explicit water rights language in the deed. That spring did not just provide water for my farm. It was my spring, legally and exclusively. The next morning, I walked out to the northwest corner of my property, where the spring bubbled up from underground. I had passed this spot thousands of times without giving it much thought. The water emerged from a cluster of rocks, formed a small pool, and then flowed downhill through a series of channels and culverts. For the first time, I followed that flow. The water ran along the edge of my property line and then disappeared into a large concrete pipe that ran under the road. I had never wondered where it went from there. I spent the morning tracing the path of that pipe. It ran directly into the Meadowbrook Hills development, where it connected to the main water distribution system. Every single house in Karen's perfect neighborhood was getting its water from my spring. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The developers had built their entire water infrastructure around my spring without ever securing legal rights to use it. They had been stealing my water for 15 years, and nobody had ever noticed or complained because I had never restricted access. I drove to the county courthouse and pulled all the public records for the Meadowbrook Hills development. The water rights section of their permits was almost blank. They had never applied for independent water rights because they had never needed them. My spring provided more than enough water for their entire community. That afternoon, I called a lawyer who specialized in water rights. Janet Morrison had been practicing environmental law for 20 years, and she understood the implications of my discovery immediately. "Mr. Miller," she said after reviewing my deed, "you have exclusive rights to that spring. The development has been using your water without permission for 15 years. Legally, you can cut them off tomorrow if you want to." "Can they force me to provide water?" I asked. "Not unless they want to pay for it," Janet explained. "Water rights are property rights, and property rights are protected by the same constitutional provisions that are supposed to protect your farm. The difference is that water rights are much harder to take through eminent domain because they are considered essential infrastructure." I felt a surge of hope for the first time in months. What would happen if I restricted access to the spring? Janet smiled grimly. 200 houses would lose their water supply. Property values would collapse overnight. The county would have to find alternative water sources, which would cost millions of dollars and take years to implement. It would be a disaster for everyone involved. "Including Karen Pemberton," I said. "Especially Karen Pemberton," Janet confirmed. "Her house would be worthless without water access. Her husband's construction company would have to deal with the liability issues. The entire development would be uninhabitable." I drove home that afternoon with a plan forming in my mind. Karen had used legal manipulation and political connections to try to destroy my farm. She had turned my own county government against me. She had corrupted the system and perverted the democratic process for her own financial gain. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had built her entire scheme on land that depended on my generosity. Every morning when she showered in her McMansion, she was using water from my spring. Every time she watered her perfect lawn, she was stealing resources from my property. Her entire lifestyle was built on the foundation of my family's land. Now I held the power to turn off that foundation. I spent the evening walking around my farm, looking at everything with new eyes. The spring that had seemed like just another natural feature was actually the heart of a much larger system. My grandfather had not just left me 40 acres of farmland. He had left me control over the lifeblood of an entire community. Karen thought she had won. She thought the county commission vote had sealed my fate. She had no idea that her victory was about to become her greatest vulnerability. It was time to teach her what real power looked like. I hired a professional plumber to install a valve system at the spring source. Nothing fancy, just a simple shutoff valve that would allow me to control the flow of water from my property to the development. The plumber was curious about why I needed it, but I just told him I wanted better control over my irrigation system. While the valve was being installed, I worked with Janet Morrison to prepare the legal documentation. We drafted letters to every homeowner in Meadowbrook Hills, explaining that they had been using my water without permission for 15 years. The letters were polite but firm, informing them that I would be exercising my exclusive water rights and that they had 72 hours to make alternative arrangements. The letters also included copies of my grandfather's deed, highlighting the water rights language that gave me complete control over the spring. I wanted every homeowner to understand that this was not a neighbor dispute or a zoning issue. This was about fundamental property rights that had been established decades before their houses were even built. But the most important letter went to Karen Pemberton and the HOA board. Their letter included an additional paragraph explaining that I would be willing to negotiate a long-term water usage agreement, but only if the HOA withdrew its support for the eminent domain seizure of my farm. "The choice is yours," I wrote. "You can continue trying to steal my land or you can continue using my water, but you cannot do both." I had all the letters certified and delivered on the same day. Then I sat back and waited for the chaos to begin. The first call came from Karen within 2 hours of the letters being delivered. She was screaming before I even finished saying hello. "You cannot do this," she shrieked. "You cannot just cut off water to 200 families." "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "It is my water on my land, protected by my grandfather's deed. I have been generous enough to share it for 15 years, but generosity is not a legal obligation." "This is extortion," Karen yelled. "I will call the police, I will call the county, I will call the state." "Please do," I said. "I would love for them to review the legal documentation. Maybe they can explain to you how property rights work." The next day, my phone rang constantly. Panicked homeowners, angry HOA board members, desperate real estate agents. Everyone wanted to know if I was serious about cutting off their water supply. Everyone wanted to negotiate some kind of deal. The county commissioners called an emergency meeting. Commissioner Williams, the same man who had dismissed my concerns about destroying the farm, suddenly wanted to discuss reasonable solutions to the water rights issue. I attended the meeting with Janet Morrison, and we listened politely while they explained how important it was to maintain community stability. "Mr. Miller," Commissioner Williams said, "surely we can work out some arrangement that serves everyone's interests." "Certainly," I said. "Withdraw the eminent domain seizure, and I will be happy to negotiate a fair water usage agreement." The commissioners looked uncomfortable. They had made a deal with Karen and her husband's construction company. Backing down now would embarrass them and cost them political capital. But allowing 200 families to lose their water supply would be a much bigger disaster. Karen tried everything she could think of to maintain her position. She hired her own lawyer to challenge my water rights. She lobbied the commissioners to declare the water supply a public utility. She even tried to organize the HOA to file a lawsuit against me for restraint of trade. None of it worked. Janet Morrison had done her homework and my legal position was rock solid. I owned the spring, I owned the water, and I had the right to control access to my own property. The deadline I had set was approaching fast. 72 hours to withdraw the eminent domain petition, or I would shut off the valve. Real estate agents began fleeing the development like rats from a sinking ship. Home sales fell to zero overnight. Property values dropped by 30% as word spread that the entire neighborhood might lose its water supply. 2 families put their houses on the market within 24 hours of receiving my letter. Karen's perfect world was collapsing around her, and she was finally beginning to understand what it felt like to be powerless against a system that did not care about her needs or concerns. On the final day, she came to my farm in person. She looked haggard and desperate, a far cry from the polished HOA president who had threatened me months earlier. "Please," she said, standing in my driveway, "there has to be another way to resolve this." I looked at her for a long moment, thinking about all the violation notices she had sent me, all the condescending conversations, all the months she had spent plotting to destroy my family's legacy for her own profit. "There is another way," I said. "Withdraw the eminent domain petition, resign from the HOA, and leave my farm alone." Karen's face went pale. "You know I cannot do that. Too much has been invested. Too many people are depending on this project." I walked over to the valve that controlled the water flow to her entire community. My hand rested on the metal handle that could change everything. "Then I guess we are done talking," I said. And I turned off their water. The emergency HOA meeting was called for 8 o'clock that evening. I was not invited, but I could see the cars lined up outside the community center from my kitchen window. Every house in Meadowbrook Hills was represented. They were all facing the same crisis. No water, no solutions, and no idea how long the situation would last. Janet Morrison called me at 9:30 with the news I had been waiting for. "Jake, I just got off the phone with the county attorney. The commissioners are calling an emergency session tomorrow morning to reconsider the eminent domain seizure. They want to negotiate." "What about Karen and the HOA?" I asked. "That is the best part," Janet said. "The HOA board voted unanimously to withdraw their support for the eminent domain project. They also voted to remove Karen Pemberton as president, effective immediately." I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. Karen had spent months building her perfect scheme, cultivating political relationships, and positioning herself as the voice of the community. Now her own neighbors had turned against her in a single evening. The next morning, I sat in the same county commission meeting room where my farm had been condemned just weeks earlier. But this time, the dynamics were completely different. The commissioners were not dismissive or condescending. They were worried about a public relations disaster and desperate to find a solution. Commissioner Williams addressed me directly. "Mr. Miller, we understand you have legitimate concerns about the eminent domain seizure. We would like to explore alternatives that might serve everyone's interests." I had prepared for this moment. "I am willing to restore water access to the Meadowbrook Hills development," I said, "but I want three things in return." The commissioners leaned forward, eager to hear terms that might end the crisis. "First, the county formally withdraws the eminent domain seizure and agrees never to pursue it again. Second, my farm is designated as a protected agricultural heritage site, with permanent zoning that prevents any future development. Third, the county issues a public apology for the way this situation was handled." The commissioners exchanged glances. These were reasonable terms, much more generous than they had any right to expect. "And the water access?" Commissioner Williams asked. "I will negotiate a long-term agreement with the HOA that gives them continued access to my spring in exchange for fair compensation, and a written agreement that they will never again interfere with my farming operations." The vote was unanimous. 5 commissioners voted to withdraw the eminent domain seizure, designate my farm as a heritage site, and authorize the county attorney to draft a formal apology. That afternoon, I turned the water back on. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Karen Pemberton's house went on the market within a week. The stress of the water crisis, combined with the humiliation of her public defeat, had broken her spirit. Her husband's construction company lost the county contract and had to deal with the fallout from their role in the failed scheme. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, approached me with a completely different attitude. She understood that cooperation was better than confrontation, and she was genuinely interested in preserving the rural character that had attracted people to the area in the first place. "We would like to work with you, Mr. Miller," she said during our first meeting. "Some of our residents are interested in starting community gardens. Others want to learn about sustainable farming. Maybe we can find ways to benefit from having a working farm in our neighborhood instead of trying to get rid of it." Over the following months, something beautiful began to happen. Several families from the development started buying produce directly from my farm. Children came by after school to help with chores and learn about agriculture. The HOA even organized a harvest festival that brought the entire community together. The water usage agreement we negotiated was fair to everyone. The HOA pays me a monthly fee for access to the spring, which helps support my farming operations. In return, I provide a reliable water supply and educational programs about sustainable agriculture. My farm is now protected by county ordinance and state law. It can never be seized for development or converted to non-agricultural use. The heritage designation ensures that future generations will be able to experience the same rural lifestyle that my grandfather worked so hard to preserve. Karen Pemberton moved back to the city 6 months after the water crisis ended. I heard she got a job with a property management company, far away from farming and HOA politics. I hope she learned something from our conflict, but I honestly do not spend much time thinking about her anymore. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about what happened to Karen and her family. The truth is, I feel sorry for anyone who thinks they can build their success on someone else's destruction. But I do not regret standing up for my rights or protecting my family's legacy. My grandfather always said that the land would protect those who protected it. He was right, but he also taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you. Especially when they try to turn your farm into a dog park.